Hey, I'm Blair Best. It's Wednesday here on The Story, and tonight I talk one-on-one with Tigard's new mayor after two recent high-profile resignations in City Hall, including the city manager who resigned this week. Plus, some Oregon National Guard troops are demobilizing. Despite them not being used in Portland, we investigate who is protecting the ice building. But first, we've been keeping tabs on the I-5 bridge replacement project between Portland and Vancouver. The leader is soon stepping down. A new cost estimate is expected next month, and a critical hurdle involving the U.S. Coast Guard is ahead. And it's our big story tonight. So the Interstate Bridge Replacement Team, or IBR, has submitted its updated report to the U.S. Coast Guard. The big issue is the height of the new bridge and how that relates to clearance for boats passing underneath. Even though we're less than a year away from construction starting, if all goes to plan, we still don't know for sure how tall this thing is going to be and whether it will be a fixed span or include a movable span. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, last week we brought you highlights from our one-on-one interview with the outgoing IBR leader, Greg Johnson. Here's what he said about the difference between those bridge designs.
So a fixed span, of course, has no movable parts. The current bridge is a movable span. It's a lift bridge where that section of the bridge goes up to allow river traffic to pass underneath. That's taller than the other spans. So movable spans are notoriously expensive and notoriously difficult to manage. You have built-in operations and maintenance costs forever because you have to staff it 365 days a year.
The IBR team has a clear preference. They want a fixed span, and they want it to be 116 feet high. But they don't get the final say. It's ultimately up to the Coast Guard because they need to issue a permit before construction can begin. Now, this has been a thorny issue all the way back to the failed Columbia River crossing plan more than a decade ago. Here's why. The current drawbridge can lift all the way to 178 feet, which is what the Coast Guard and others have been working with for more than a century. A few years ago, when IBR basically asked the Coast Guard how high they would like the new bridge, they were told 178 feet. So, IBR has been on a mission to convince the Coast Guard to approve their plan of 116 feet.
The Coast Guard, their sole interest is is river traffic being impeded. So we don't criticize the Coast Guard. That's their mission and we understand it. But we think we have put forth a solution that can satisfy all needs and all users, both on the river and in those other modes.
Is there anything specific that goes into 116 just as opposed to 115, 117? Like what makes it that number?
The 116 allows us to have ramp grades because there's a lot of truck traffic and freight traffic that comes through that corridor to allow those trucks to get up those ramps and up to speed in a reasonable way. You start building it steeper, they have trouble getting up to speed.
Okay, that solution that Johnson referenced earlier is what the updated report is all about, which stresses that the 116-foot option is enough for 99% of river traffic. But what about that remaining 1%? Well, for starters, it's not always as simple as just asking, is the boat more than 116 feet tall? Each vessel has its own preferred air gap. That's an extra safety margin between the top of the ship and the bottom of the bridge. And in some of these cases, the report concludes that shaving a few feet off of that buffer can make the difference. The Columbia River's height also changes with the tide, so there are a few vessels that sometimes might be unable to cross. With those caveats in mind, the report says no government or recreational vessel operators would be significantly impacted by the 116-foot design. But 4 commercial companies would be, and they're named in the report: JT Marine, Advanced American Construction, Greenberry, and Thompson Metal Fab. Each of them either operates a vessel that would be too tall or occasionally uses the river to ship things that would also be too tall. In each case, the report says IBR reached a confidential agreement with the companies to mitigate those impacts.
We have been working with the affected river users and to get to an agreement where they will maintain their presence in the locations, but either build smaller modules that can fit underneath the 116-foot bridge, or have a satellite site that can build the bigger things downstream of our bridge.
In a news release on Tuesday, IBR said all of those agreements total around $140 million. The team argues that's a bargain when you compare it to a movable span design, which they say would cost at least $500 million more for construction and cost about $1 million more per year to run. Now, because of the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, those at the Coast Guard who would have reviewed the latest report were furloughed for more than a month. But now that the government is back open, here's what Johnson says about when a decision is expected.
The shortest time frame that we have heard from the Coast Guard is 90 days to get to a preliminary navigational clearance determination. So now that is taking us into, I believe, mid-February to get that determination.
Okay, the last time IBR asked the Coast Guard for its opinion, it took closer to 6 months to get an answer. So 3 months is the best case scenario. But if the Coast Guard does approve 116 feet, the process for the formal permit can begin. If it's denied, then IBR will need to switch gears and build a drawbridge. And that's something local elected officials really want to avoid. Washington Governor Bob Ferguson met with the Coast Guard last month, and his office told us, quote, he and our staff made the case for a fixed span and answered questions from the Coast Guard. A fixed span bridge, removing the only stoplight on I-5 between Canada and Mexico, has broad consensus across many stakeholders. Governor Ferguson has been personally involved because he understands how critical this project is for our state. But here's the kicker. When it comes to that 116-foot bridge height, the Coast Guard already approved that number way back in 2013 for the failed Columbia River crossing project. It was the Washington legislature that ultimately doomed that plan, failing to pass key funding at the time. The Coast Guard's approval expired after 3 years, so IBR had to start from scratch. So now, the hope is that if the Coast Guard already said yes to the 116 feet in the past, they could do it again. Well, we'll have to wait until at least February to find out. Okay, let's head south on I-5 to the state capitol in Salem, where today an economic outlook and revenue forecast made waves among state lawmakers as they gear up for the 2026 short session. Instead of us trying to redo the numbers and explain what they mean, here's Oregon State economist.
The main takeaway, I think, is that the economy has demonstrated some very important resilience this year. After the tariffs were initially announced back in April, a lot of forecasters were anticipating an outright downturn or recession at the national level, and of course that would translate directly through to the state of Oregon, particularly given the importance of trade and manufacturing in the state. That has not come to pass. And in fact, one of the key takeaways from the forecast this time around was the potential for an economic inflection coming into view. In other words, a reacceleration of the economy.
Now, when it comes to how lawmakers see things, the biggest numbers being thrown around from the report have to do with the deficit in the state's general fund for the current 2-year budget cycle. Before today, that deficit was more than $370 million. But with the better than expected numbers, that deficit is down to just $63 million. State Republicans jumped at the chance to make their case that the shrinking deficit means higher taxes or that plans for them are not needed. The Senate Leader Bruce Starr writing, a $63.1 million deficit is a drop in the bucket for a state with a $140 billion budget. People are already stretched thin and they need relief, not new burdens. And Governor Tina Kotek choosing a different tone. While this forecast, she says, reflects the resilience of Oregon's overall economy, my focus remains on the people who are struggling right now. We must hold the line against President Trump's attacks on working families through cuts to food assistance and health care. We must continue to lean in on what's working to address the cost of living across the state. Now, as you heard from the state economist earlier, the risk of recession is lessening, but that doesn't necessarily mean things are getting better for everyone.
As we look at the lower income quartiles, we can see that there's a more pronounced deterioration of economic conditions. There's softer wage gains happening in those sectors. At the same time that price pressures are proving to be persistent, while folks fall into different parts of the income spectrum, we kind of all shop at the same grocery stores. We experience the same price pressures. And so an upper income household may be able to tolerate those price pressures and the inflation in their grocery basket. But lower income households do face a struggle at a time where wages are decelerating, but prices are not.
Well, turning to Tigard now, where there have been two high-profile resignations from inside City Hall in recent months. In September, a mayor member, former Mayor Heidi Lube, abruptly resigned, citing multiple issues, including conflicting dynamics within city government between herself, other councilors, and city staff. An investigation followed involving complaints against her. Well, fast forward to this week, when Tigard's city manager, Brent Stockwell, resigned after just 6 months on the job. He posted this statement on LinkedIn, announcing he is leaving Tigard and returning home to Arizona. He goes on to say, "While this wasn't the timeline I expected, I'm proud of the work we accomplished in Tigard and grateful to all who welcomed me back to the Pacific Northwest." We have reached out to Stockwell and we have not heard back yet. So today I talked with Tigard's new mayor and former city councilor Ikan Hu about these recent changes. Here's part of that conversation. City Manager Brent Stockwell submitted his resignation on Tuesday, and your statement said it comes after recent discussions about the city's leadership direction. How would you describe Tigard's leadership direction?
So right now, I believe the city leadership is excellent. We're strong. Right now, the day-to-day operation is under the direction of Assistant City Manager Emily Trish. And our city staff continues to provide excellent service to our residents that they expect and deserve.
This is the second high-profile resignation in Tigard in recent months, with former Mayor Heidi Lube resigning in September, citing conflict with city councilors and staff. So what sort of message do you think this sends to Tigard residents?
Well, as mentioned, the former mayor resigned earlier this year. And when she resigned, after she resigned, the council made a commitment to our community that we will do better. So with our leadership, with our communication, and with accountability across our organization.
What do you have to say to the people of Tigard who see these two high-profile resignations in recent months and they kind of wondering what is going on inside City Hall?
Ultimately, the city is more than just one or two people, right? It's about all of us working together to achieve the goal we want to see achieved. So all I can say is that the council is still committed to do better.
When you say you want City Council to do better, you really mean just the communication and transparency with the public?
And just with how we work together, right? Obviously, the previous report that came out about the mayor did mention about friction and conflict between her and the council members. So right now, we can work. My understanding or my belief is that we are working better right now. So we will be able to do our job better.
Mayor Hu's term lasts through the end of next year, and we're told that Tigard city councilors and supervisors will go through respectful workplace training in January. Well, coming up next on the story, a KGW investigation into the agencies responsible for protecting the ice building in South Portland. Plus, we delve into the authority they're given when it comes to use of force and how some believe they're crossing the line. That's next when the story returns. Well, Oregon's governor says she received a verbal confirmation that all 200 members of the Oregon National Guard called on by the feds to protect the ice building would be demobilized. But the feds quickly said, hey, not so fast. 100 of those troops remain activated. So here's what we know so far. 100 Oregon troops and all 200 California Guard members who were sent to Oregon are now in Texas to demobilize, which involves health screening and paperwork. The process typically takes about a week, which means this mission lasted about 50 days. The Oregon Military Department estimated that the cost, $16 million, paid for with federal tax dollars. Meanwhile, the legal fight over troop deployment in Oregon is not over. The Ninth Circuit Court just issued an order temporarily allowing the federal government to keep control of the Oregon National Guard while it waits for the U.S. Supreme Court to rule in a connected case out of Illinois. So who is responsible for securing Portland's ice building? Well, it turns out the boots on the ground and often on the rooftop are not ICE agents, but often come from little-known federal agencies, those with broad and sometimes controversial authority, and it appears without clearly defined limits. Here's investigative reporter Kyla Boshi.
Streets filled with smoke, tear gas, and crowd control munitions. For months, there have been sporadic clashes between federal officers and protesters outside Portland's ICE facility. So what's going on here? Who are these officers? And have they crossed the line? Demonstrations against President Trump's immigration policies began in early June and have largely been peaceful. The protests have been focused here, at the ICE facility in South Portland. It sits away from downtown, in the South Waterfront neighborhood. The building is leased by the federal government and protected by the Department of Homeland Security, a job normally done by the Federal Protective Service. But on the ground, we've also seen teams of officers from other agencies called upon to support FPS in what's known as cross-designation. There have been specially trained units, including U.S. Border Patrol BORTAC, a special response team from ICE, along with officers from the Bureau of Prisons. Most nights follow a familiar pattern. Officers emerge from the front gate, then push out in a U-shape or wedge formation, clearing the way for vehicles to enter or exit the ICE building. Although protesters are sometimes antagonistic, video appears to show officers at times responding with disproportionate force. On October 2nd, Leilani Payne stood in front of officers on the street after they cleared the exit, allowing a car to leave the property. She complied, but after the 19-year-old shouted insults and swore at the officers, one of them blasted her with chemical spray in the face. Payne said she had trouble breathing, burning in her eyes, ears, and throat. In some instances, federal officers appeared to attack when there was no apparent threat. Videos show protesters who crossed the blue line marked U.S. Government Do Not Block were tackled by a team of officers. On August 13th, protester Darren Hertzberg was standing outside the driveway when a federal officer tackled him from behind. Smoke was deployed. Hertzberg said he was taken into custody and cited for failure to comply. Homeland Security policy allows officers to use force only when no reasonably effective, safe, and feasible alternative exists. And they can only use a level of force that is objectively reasonable. On several nights, the policy appeared to be tested. Officers blanketed the street with smoke and tear gas, used flashbangs, pepper balls, and other less than lethal munitions. Their actions often seemed to make the situation worse, instead of calming it down. On October 18th, a large crowd of peaceful protesters gathered outside the ICE facility following a No Kings rally. KGW zoomed in and slowed the video. It showed a federal officer who fired a less than lethal round into the ground, ricocheting toward the ICE building. That triggered federal officers to deploy tear gas on the crowd. The intent of tear gas is dispersal, but misuse or abuse can cause injuries or inflame tensions even more. As of mid-November, federal court records indicate 36 people have been charged with crimes related to the ICE facility in Portland since June. Some of those cases involved assaults on federal officers, arson, and property damage. Federal law gives U.S. Homeland Security broad authority to protect federal buildings, with no clear limit on how far off-site officers can operate. For example, this video showed a team of federal officers walking away from the ICE building to make an arrest on September 30th. They marched down the street and out of camera view. At the same time, Homeland Security has used helicopters and drones to circle overhead, frustrating neighbors and inflaming tensions. The conflict over immigration policy and attempts by President Trump to deploy National Guard troops helped mobilize a new strategy among protesters: inflatable costumes. But even those in costume have faced off with federal officers. On October 2nd, Seth Todd said he was peacefully protesting in a frog suit when an officer aimed chemical spray directly at his costume's air vent. Protesters and local officials accused the federal government of abusing its authority. Similar complaints were made during the 2020 racial justice protests in Portland, which centered around the federal courthouse. A government audit found that many of those federal officers deployed to Portland in 2020 were not sufficiently trained or prepared for the operation. Many of the same border and security forces have returned to Portland, this time to protect the ICE building. The Federal Protective Service was created to protect public buildings. Now the question is, who's protecting the public? We shared some of the videos in the story with the Department of Homeland Security. In response, a spokesperson wrote, ICE and CBP are trained to use the minimum amount of force necessary to resolve dangerous situations to prioritize the safety of the public and themselves. The statement went on to say that officers use de-escalation tactics and receive ongoing use of force training. Kyle Aboshi, KGW News.
Well, if you have a story for our investigative team, you can email investigators@kgw.com or call the tip line and leave a message. It's 503-226-5041. We're back right after this. Well, tonight we're airing a special at 8 o'clock on our TV app, KGW+. It is called KGW Community Cares, Feeding the People. So when the government shut down, a lot of families suddenly weren't sure if their SNAP benefits would come through, and the uncertainty brought a lot of folks together in some pretty incredible ways. So we're sharing their stories tonight at 8 on KGW+, and you can download that app for free right now on Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. Well, that's the end of our show, folks. Thanks so much for watching. The good stuff is coming your way next. And don't forget, everyone has a story to tell. In the meantime, have a great Wednesday night. I'll see you right back here tomorrow night at 6:30.